The high desert of northern Arizona is a land of profound and terrible beauty. It's a place where the earth is stripped bare, where the wind whispers secrets through canyons carved over millennia, and where a person can disappear as easily as a drop of rain on hot sand. In the late 1990s, a new kind of predator began to haunt this stark, beautiful landscape. He was a phantom, a whisper of fear that moved through the lonely highways and remote hiking trails. He wore the guise of a holy man, but he was a demon cloaked in sanctimony, a devil in the desert. His name was Elias Thorne. Elias Thorne was not born of the desert. He was born of the Rust Belt's decay, a product of a broken home in a forgotten corner of Ohio. His story was a depressingly familiar one: a mother who walked away, a father whose love was delivered through the back of his hand and the buckle of his belt. As a child, he was a feral creature, known for stealing from mailboxes and torturing small animals. He even broke his younger sister's arm in a fit of rage over a stolen piece of candy. At 14, he ran away from home and became a ghost, a drifter who learned the hard lessons of the road. He learned how to steal, how to lie, and how to disappear. His deep, venomous hatred of women, the poison that fueled his later atrocities, was born of a single, searing betrayal. A girlfriend, a woman he thought he loved, had left him for another man, laughing at his poverty and his lack of prospects. That laughter became the soundtrack to his rage. It was the moment the feral boy became a budding monster. In his twisted mind, she had condemned her entire gender. They all deserved to pay for her sins. He drifted west, drawn to the vast empty spaces where a man could get lost. He found a strange kind of peace in the desert's indifference, and he found a perfect disguise. He began to affect the appearance of a wandering penitent, a man on a spiritual journey. He wore simple, dark robes, the kind you might see on a monk in a monastery. He didn't shave his head or carry a prayer book. His disguise was more subtle. It was in his quiet demeanor, his soft-spoken voice, his air of humble piety. It was a mask designed to leverage the inherent trust people place in a man of God. It was a key designed to unlock their deepest vulnerabilities. The investigation into the Desert Pilgrim, as the press would later call him, began on February 10, 1999. A pair of hikers exploring a remote canyon near the outskirts of Sedona found the body of a woman. Her name was Brenda Wallace. She had been strangled. Her hands were bound behind her back with a length of coarse rope. There were bruises on her wrists and arms, the telltale signs of a violent struggle. There was no sign of robbery. Her wallet was untouched. Her expensive hiking watch was still on her wrist, but on the inside of her wedding ring, police found a small personal inscription: Brenda and Mark forever. The killer hadn't taken her valuables. He had only taken her life. The case was assigned to Detective Frank Nolan of the Coconino County Sheriff's Department. Nolan was a man of the desert, as weathered and unyielding as the landscape he policed. He was a former Marine, a man who believed in order and saw the world in black and white, and he knew with a gut-level certainty that the murder of Brenda Wallace was not an isolated incident. The initial investigation was a series of dead ends. The remote location meant there were no witnesses. There was no CCTV footage. The killer had been meticulous, leaving behind no clear fingerprints, no obvious DNA. The vast, rugged terrain made a search for evidence, like looking for a single grain of sand on a miles-long beach. Nolan's breakthrough came from the cold case files. He found 4 other unsolved murders from the previous year, all with a chillingly similar modus operandi. 4 women, all strangled, all left in remote, desolate locations across northern Arizona and southern Utah, all with no signs of robbery. The cases had been handled by different departments, and no one had connected the dots until now. The discovery of another body, a young college student named Emily Carr, found in a shallow grave near a scenic overlook on the road to the Grand Canyon, solidified Nolan's terrible theory. A serial killer was hunting in his desert. The only common thread, a vague, whispered detail from a park ranger who had seen a strange man in dark robes, like a monk, walking near the overlook a day before Emily's body was found, was too thin to be a real lead. It was a ghost story. Elias Thorne was a master of evasion. He moved through the desert like a coyote, silent and unseen. He knew the winding back roads, the hidden springs, the ancient Native American trails that weren't on any map. He could live off the land for weeks, sleeping in caves and abandoned miners' shacks. He was a ghost, a phantom who could materialize on a lonely stretch of highway and then vanish back into the canyons without a trace. He was cautious, retreating at the first sign of a trap, melting back into the wilderness if he encountered a group of people instead of a lone, vulnerable target. His targets were women, any women. He did not have a type. His victims ranged in age from a 16-year-old runaway to a 56-year-old birdwatcher. His only requirement was that they be alone and vulnerable. His method was always the same. He would approach them with his mask of humble piety. He would ask for directions. He would offer to share a shortcut on a trail. He would speak of spiritual matters, his voice a low, calming baritone. He would put them at ease. And then, when their guard was down, when they were in a place where no one could see or hear, the mask would drop. He would subdue them with a sudden, shocking violence. He would grab them, choke them, his hands like iron vices. He would drag them from their cars or off the trail into the scrub brush and the rocks. He would rape them, and then he would strangle the life out of them, his face a mask of cold, concentrated rage. He would take his time, savoring their terror, and then he would hide their bodies, dumping them in ravines or burying them in shallow graves, leaving them for the sun and the scavengers. But Elias Thorne was not perfect. He made mistakes. And it was these small mistakes, these tiny tears in his cloak of invisibility, that would eventually lead to his downfall. Several women survived his attacks. They were the lucky ones. They fought back, or a passing car would appear unexpectedly, or a group of hikers would come around a bend in the trail, forcing him to flee. These survivors provided Nolan with the first real details about the killer. They all described the same man, tall, wiry, with cold, dead eyes. They described his husky, soft-spoken voice that could turn to a guttural snarl in an instant. They described his simple, dark robes made of a rough, cheap fabric, not the fine wool of a real monk's habit. And several of them mentioned a distinctive, long, jagged scar on his left forearm. The most crucial piece of evidence came from a survivor named Sarah Jenkins. She was a tough, smart woman, an experienced hiker who had been attacked on a trail in Zion National Park. As Elias was dragging her off the path, she had fought back with a ferocity he hadn't expected. In the struggle, she had managed to bite his arm, hard. As he recoiled in pain, she had scrambled away, leaving him bleeding in the dust. When she reported the attack, the police found something on the sleeve of her torn shirt, a small, dark smear of blood. It wasn't hers. The lab ran a DNA test. It didn't match anyone in the national database, but now they had him. They had his genetic fingerprint. The ghost now had a shadow. Nolan and his multi-agency task force began to employ new strategies. They knew they couldn't catch him with traditional police work. The desert was too big, he was too cunning, so they started to think like him. They adopted a strategy they called bait and bleed. They would visibly reduce their patrols in a certain area, creating the illusion of safety, hoping to lure him out. And then they would saturate the area with undercover officers, waiting in ambush. They used female officers as decoys. A brave young deputy named Maria Sanchez spent weeks posing as a tourist, a stranded motorist, a lone hiker, walking the same remote trails where other women had been attacked. She was always armed, always with a hidden backup team just out of sight. But Elias Thorne was too smart. He seemed to have a sixth sense for a trap. He never took the bait. The task force meticulously searched every potential hiding spot in a 100-mile radius. Old shacks, caves, abandoned mines. They monitored small-town grocery stores and remote gas stations looking for a man matching his description buying supplies. They were always one step behind him. The hunt for the desert pilgrim became a media sensation. The story of the monk-like killer stalking the beautiful, lonely landscapes of the Southwest captured the public's imagination. Fear spread through the tourist towns. The hiking trails grew quiet. Everyone was looking for a man in dark robes. The final trap was born of a simple deduction. Elias Thorne was wounded. The bite on his arm, according to the survivor, had been deep. In the unsanitary conditions of the wilderness, it would likely get infected. He would need antibiotics. He would need medical attention. The task force put out a silent alert to every pharmacy, every clinic, every hospital in a 3-state area. They were looking for a man with a severe animal or human bite on his left arm, and they laid a new kind of trap. They knew that many of the old, remote Catholic missions and monasteries in the desert had well-stocked infirmaries and kitchens. They were places of sanctuary, often left unlocked. They reasoned that the killer, desperate and in pain, might see one of these places as an easy target for food and medical supplies. Nolan's team disguised several of their toughest male officers as monks. They sent them to live in a small remote monastery in the New Mexico desert, a place that fit the profile perfectly. They waited. For days, there was nothing. The monks went about their daily routines of prayer and work, their eyes always scanning the horizon. In the pre-dawn hours of June 1st, 1999, their patience was rewarded. A silent alarm, tripped on the door of the monastery's kitchen, alerted the team. An officer, a large, powerful man who had once been a linebacker, went to investigate. He found a gaunt, shadowy figure inside, stuffing loaves of bread and cans of food into a sack. "You're not welcome here, brother," the officer said, his voice calm, his hand resting on the butt of the gun hidden beneath his cassock. Elias Thorne spun around, his eyes wild with pain and fever. He saw the size of the man blocking his exit. He didn't hesitate. He lunged, a knife appearing in his hand as if from nowhere. The officer was ready. He deflected the knife, and the two men crashed to the floor in a brutal, desperate struggle. Thorne fought like a cornered animal with a wiry, desperate strength. In the struggle, the sleeve of his dark robe was torn away, revealing his left forearm, and there it was, a long, jagged, hideously infected scar with the clear, unmistakable marks of a human bite. He was subdued, captured, the ghost finally made flesh. The interrogation of Elias Thorne was a journey into the abyss. At first he was defiant, uncooperative. He refused to eat. He refused to speak. He would sit in the interrogation room for hours, staring at Nolan with his dead, cold eyes, a faint, mocking smile on his lips. He seemed to be savoring his final act of defiance. But Nolan was patient. He used Thorne's infected arm against him. He withheld medical treatment, letting the pain and the fever do their work. Finally, as the infection raged and the pain became unbearable, Thorne began to talk. And he confessed. He confessed to everything. He admitted to 21 murders. He described in chilling, dispassionate detail how he had stalked, raped, and strangled his victims. He told them where he had hidden the bodies of the women who were still missing, his descriptions of the location so precise that search teams were able to recover the remains of 7 more victims. He showed no remorse, not a flicker. His only regret, he said with a sneer, was that he hadn't killed more. He seemed to take a perverse pride in his ability to have eluded them for so long. He saw the entire investigation as a game, a contest of wits between him and the police. A game he had until the very end been winning. "They all deserved it," he snarled at Nolan, his voice a raw, hate-filled rasp. "Every last one of them. They're all the same. They lie, they cheat, they laugh at you. I just gave them what was coming to them." The trial of Elias Thorne was a formality. His confession, the DNA evidence, the testimony of the survivors, it was an avalanche of guilt. On August 10th, 1999, he was sentenced to death. He received the sentence with the same cold indifference he had shown throughout the entire process. He was a man for whom life and death had ceased to have any meaning. The case of the Desert Pilgrim left a deep scar on the landscape of the American Southwest. He was not just a serial killer. He was a devil in monk's robes, a monster who had weaponized trust, who had turned a symbol of peace into a mask for unspeakable violence. His capture was a victory for law enforcement, a testament to their patience and their ingenuity, but it was also a dark, chilling reminder, a reminder that evil can wear any face. A reminder that in the vast, lonely places of the world, it is wise to be wary of strangers, especially those who claim to be men of God. For sometimes, the devil's favorite disguise is the cloak of a saint. The execution of Elias Thorne was a quiet, clinical affair. A sterile room, a gurney, a needle. It was an antiseptic end for a man whose life had been a whirlwind of filth and violence. For the public, for the media, the story was over. The monster was gone. The desert could sleep peacefully again. But for Detective Frank Nolan, the silence that followed was more unsettling than the hunt itself. Nolan had retired a year after the trial. He had given 30 years of his life to the job, and the Thorne case had been his last, a brutal, exhausting magnum opus. He bought a small ranch house on a few acres of land outside of Flagstaff, a place where the sky was huge and the silence was deep. He thought he could leave the job behind, but the desert doesn't forget, and neither did Nolan. The faces of the victims, the cold, dead light in Elias Thorne's eyes, they were ghosts that had followed him into his retirement. He kept the case files, all of them, boxes and boxes of them, stored in his home office. He would spend hours at night, long after his wife had gone to bed, poring over the old reports, the crime scene photos, the transcripts of Thorne's confession. He was looking for something, a loose thread, a piece that didn't fit. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had caught the killer, but they hadn't understood the crime. The thing that gnawed at him was the number, 21. Elias Thorne had confessed to killing 21 women. The task force had found the bodies, or the remains, of 19. That left two women whose names were unknown, whose families had never reported them missing, whose bodies were still out there somewhere in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. 2 final silent victims. Nolan became obsessed with finding them. It was a private, solitary quest. He used his pension money to buy a used 4-wheel drive truck and high-end satellite mapping software. He cross-referenced Thorne's confession, which was often vague and rambling about the locations of these last 2 murders, with geological surveys, old mining maps, and weather patterns from the time of the killings. He became a ghost himself, a familiar, weathered figure in the small towns and on the back roads of northern Arizona. He would spend weeks at a time out in the desert, his truck loaded with water, food, and digging equipment. He was searching for graves. He was hunting for the final echoes of Elias Thorne's rage. His wife thought he was losing his mind. His old colleagues at the sheriff's department worried about him. "Let it go, Frank," his former partner would tell him over the phone. "You caught him. You can't save them all." But Nolan couldn't let it go. It was more than just finding the bodies. It was about something Thorne had said during his confession, a small, boastful comment that the interrogators had dismissed as the rambling of a madman. "They weren't all mine," Thorne had sneered. "Sometimes I had help. Sometimes the desert provides its own." What did that mean? The official theory was that Thorne was a lone wolf, a solitary predator, but that one cryptic sentence hinted at something else, something darker. One hot afternoon in late September, nearly 3 years after Thorne's execution, Nolan was exploring a remote box canyon deep in the Navajo Nation, a place Thorne had mentioned in passing. It was a place of stunning, desolate beauty, with sheer red rock walls and a sandy, sun-baked floor. He was about to give up for the day when he saw it, a small pile of rocks, arranged in a way that was not quite natural. It was the kind of subtle marker that only a man who had spent a lifetime reading the landscape would notice. He started to dig. The ground was hard, rocky. After an hour of back-breaking work, his shovel hit something. Not a rock. Something else. He dug carefully with his hands, brushing away the dry soil. It was a piece of rotted leather, the sole of a boot. He kept digging, and he found her. She was little more than a skeleton wrapped in the tattered remains of her clothes. But around her wrist was a delicate silver bracelet with a single turquoise stone, a piece of jewelry that would be easy to trace. This was one of them, one of the 2 missing victims. He had found her. A quiet sense of triumph and a profound sadness washed over him. He had given her back her name. He called it in. A team from the sheriff's department and the medical examiner's office came out. As they were carefully excavating the remains, one of the young deputies found something else a few feet from the grave. It was an old, rusted tin box, the kind miners used to carry their lunch. Inside, wrapped in an oilcloth, was a small leather-bound journal. The journal did not belong to the victim. The handwriting was a cramped, spidery scrawl, and it was not written in English. It was a strange mix of Spanish and what looked like a Native American dialect. Nolan took the journal. He knew a professor at Northern Arizona University, a linguistics expert who specialized in the lost languages of the region. He drove to the university that same day. The professor, a quiet, scholarly woman, spent a week with the journal. When she called Nolan back, her voice was trembling. "Frank," she said, "this journal, it's 150 years old. It belonged to a Spanish missionary, a priest who was sent here in the 1850s to convert a small, isolated tribe of natives, a tribe that the history books say was wiped out by disease." "What does it say?" Nolan asked. "It's monstrous," the professor whispered. "This priest, he went mad. He came to believe that the desert itself was a god, a hungry god. He wrote that this god demanded sacrifices. He formed a cult. He and a handful of his converts, they would abduct people, travelers, prospectors, other natives. They would bring them to this canyon. They would torture them, and then they would kill them as an offering to the red earth." The professor took a shaky breath. According to this journal, the cult didn't die out. The priest passed his beliefs on. He wrote that the guardians of the canyon would continue the work. The journal ends with a single chilling line: "The desert is patient. The desert will always be fed." Nolan felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in his truck. A 150-year-old journal, a death cult, a hungry god. It sounded like something out of a horror novel. It couldn't be real, but what if it was? What if Elias Thorne hadn't just been a lone, psychotic killer? What if he had stumbled upon this place, this dark tradition? What if he had become the latest guardian of the canyon? It would explain his strange, almost religious fervor. It would explain his cryptic comment, "Sometimes the desert provides its own." He wasn't just killing for himself, he was killing for something else. He was feeding the desert. That left one more victim, one more body. According to the priest's journal, the offerings were always made in the same canyon. Nolan went back. He spent another month searching, walking every inch of the canyon floor. He found nothing. He was ready to give up. Maybe Thorne had lied, maybe the last victim was somewhere else entirely. He was packing up his truck, the setting sun painting the canyon walls in fiery shades of red and orange. He took one last look around, and his eyes fell on a small, dark opening at the base of the canyon wall, almost completely hidden by a rockfall and a tangle of thorny bushes. A cave. He had to clear away the rocks to get inside. The air that flowed out was cold and stale. He switched on his flashlight. The cave was small, no more than a shallow rock shelter, but it was not empty. In the back of the cave, there was a crude stone altar. And on the altar, arranged with a strange, ritualistic care, were the bones of a human being. They were old, yellowed with age, but they were not ancient. The medical examiner would later determine they were about 25 years old. They belonged to a young woman who had disappeared from a nearby town in the early 1970s, a cold case that had never been solved, and beside the bones, placed carefully on the altar, was a single, fresh object, a small wooden cross, whittled from a piece of juniper. It was the kind of thing a man might make while sitting by a campfire, the kind of thing a penitent pilgrim might carry. Nolan stared at the scene, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his hand. Elias Thorne hadn't buried his last victim. He had brought her here, to this altar. He had made her a final offering, and the wooden cross, it was his signature, a sign that the tradition was being passed on, but passed on to whom? Thorne was dead. As Nolan backed out of the cave, a stone shifted under his foot. He looked down. He saw a footprint in the dust. It was fresh. And it was not his. He felt a sudden primal fear. He was not alone in the canyon. He drew his pistol, his heart pounding in his chest. He spun around, scanning the darkening canyon. He saw nothing. He heard nothing but the whisper of the wind. But he knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, deeper than evidence, he knew. The cult was not dead. The desert was patient, and somewhere out there in the vast, beautiful, terrible silence, the new guardian was watching him, and he was hungry. The case of Elias Thorne was closed, but the case of the hungry desert had just been opened. And Frank Nolan knew that he would spend the rest of his days looking over his shoulder, wondering if the whisper on the wind was just the wind, or the patient, hungry voice of a god who was still waiting to be fed.